So, Chris, we talked about herd immunity and then these three challenges to reaching it in the United States. And I'm pleased that I think over the last couple weeks, there's once again been a renewed commitment that vaccination needs to be global. I'm not sure most countries have been very nationalistic around their own vaccination programs, but I think there's been more of a discussion within the last couple weeks, in part, I think, stimulated because of the emergence of the variants that the vaccination program needs to be global, no different than smallpox or polio. We'll see how quickly we can identify the appropriate vaccines, the funds, and the delivery systems. But I do think there's been a renewed commitment to a global vaccination program. But you have herd immunity in the US at 70%, may not get there. Then you have these three challenges. We've already talked about the short term crystal ball suggests a better May, June, and July, or one that was similar to last year. What does the late summer and the fall bring, Chris?
Well, late summer and the fall is going to be all about how much 351 or P1 spreads in the country, therefore, how much vaccine escape there is. And then I think the question about whether we see a winter surge and the timing of that winter surge is going to be a lot about how people's behavior changes. If the decline into the summer makes people sort of stop all degree of caution, stop wearing masks, go back to a pre-COVID lifestyle, then you can imagine a winter where there's more easy transmission than we had this last winter, where people have been quite cautious. And there's, some protection from the vaccination, but not good enough to stop transmission. And that's where you can construct scenarios where we have a third wave that I don't think will be as bad as what we've seen, but, can still be quite a considerable third wave.
Now, Chris, I know you're not a vaccinologist, but you've spent so much time trying to understand the evolution of the pandemic as well as the vaccines and the variants. I wanted to follow up with a few questions that always come across my desk either as submitted queries when I'm doing live streams or embedded in viewpoints. The US has held to a 3 and 4 week schedule for Pfizer and Moderna. The UK has moved away from that, in part to stretch out vaccine availability. I think some have argued in the United States, we actually are doing well. Numbers are coming down. We're vaccinating 1.5 million people a day. In the next month to 6 weeks, everyone older than 65 will likely have been offered the chance to be vaccinated. And so most of the people who are influential in the US, Dr. Fauci, many people at the CDC, Paul Offit, have wanted the US to hold on to the 3 and 4 week schedule, although there's been some prominent individuals who said we should move away from that. What thoughts do you have about that?
As you said, Howard, I'm not a vaccinologist, but my personal view on this is we have clinical trials for a reason, and we should be careful to, when we go beyond the trials, the trials had the program of vaccination with 2 doses. We should be very careful to not assume that the protection that's been observed, both in the trials after the first dose and now in the real world studies that came out yesterday in the UK and a few days before in Israel, we should be careful to not assume that the high level of protection after 1 dose that's been seen would continue into the future. We don't have a trial yet that tells us that. And so it may well be that you need that second dose to maintain the protection going forward. And so I'm of the view that we stick to what the trials have showed us and stick to the 2-dose regimen. I understand it's a very challenging choice, but as you say, we're now in this period, largely driven by seasonality, that cases and hospitalizations and deaths will be going down. And so I am of the view we stick to the 2-dose regimen.
It's likely, Chris, that in the coming weeks, the J&J vaccine will be approved. it's not nearly as effective as Moderna and Pfizer reportedly. Interestingly enough, a number of people have commented Moderna and Pfizer set the bar too high. We would have been ecstatic with 70% as the initial vaccines, but they're above 90%. How do you think human nature will interact with a vaccine that's 70% effective but one dose versus the existing vaccines that are two doses but 95%? How do you think that's going to play out? And do you hold the 70% vaccine for younger people, less likely to die, and hold the 95% effective vaccines for older individuals?
Yeah, I think there's three things that make the J&J vaccine pretty interesting and attractive, particularly on the global scale. I mean, first is it's a one-dose vaccine, and we don't really know how many people won't show up for the second vaccine dose. If you look at some of the data that's out there for the shingles vaccine, about 10% don't show up, but that's in a motivated population. It could be higher. And so you may get it may be that the difference in effectiveness isn't as large as 95 to 70.
70, yeah.
The second reason J&J is interesting is they actually, against severe disease on 351, seem to have pretty good effectiveness. I mean, overall reduced, down to about 57%, if I remember. But against severe disease, they seem to be, in the high 80s, albeit that had a pretty wide confidence interval. So we're not really sure. And then the third thing is apparently J&J, like AstraZeneca, has pretty huge production capacity. So it's certainly a more attractive vaccine against the new variant than AstraZeneca that had an effect in South Africa that was indistinguishable from no effect. So, there's lots of reasons to think that this is a very useful addition to, the set of vaccines that we have to deal with COVID. On the other hand, I think if you are somebody at risk, either from comorbidities or from age, you're going to prefer to get the 95% effective vaccine than something that's in the 70s.
Chris, we continue to struggle in the U.S. around vaccine acceptance. It has gone up. I think people have been reassured as more and more people have been vaccinated. There's been no reports with Moderna or Pfizer or the other vaccines of any adverse effects that were surprising. And certainly no emergence of serious adverse effects beyond 6 months, although, again, the data is still being accumulated. But, we have 25% of the population that is hesitant. There's a very small percent that are absolutely resistant, anti-vacciners, but it's the hesitancy population. Israel's begun to think about so-called green passes. And Zeke Emanuel had written in JAMA almost 6 or 8 months ago about immunity passports. In some regards, it was ahead of its time, although he talked about immunity vis-a-vis natural infection. Do we need to sort through a collection of incentives, not necessarily pay people, but if you get vaccinated, you can go to a sporting event. If you get vaccinated, you can go to the movies. If you get vaccinated, you can go to a restaurant. Do you think we need to think about trying to capture that last 20% of the population in a different way?
Personally, I do. I think what the Israelis are doing, makes a lot of sense in terms of creating those positive incentives for people to get vaccinated. I have spoken to some of the people in the Ministry of Health there, and even, more than a month ago, they were already thinking ahead to how do you motivate parents to, once there is a vaccine that's approved for children, to get their children vaccinated, because they're thinking that's going to be even a harder thing to achieve. And their whole strategy, which makes a lot of sense, is to create those positive incentives. And it would make a big difference for the US if we can get past that sort of 75% barrier in terms of the people willing to take a vaccine right now. Because then you start to get into the numbers where even with reduced effectiveness, you might actually stop a third wave.
Right. So if you get up to 90 or 95% of people are vaccinated, if you lose 10% because of variants, you're still above the 75%. I guess that's the kind of quick math you're doing.
Yeah, exactly. It starts to become a close run thing about blocking transmission. if you can get into those sort of range of acceptance.
Yeah, I was talking to some people this morning, and it was interesting. One of them is a health officer at a major campus, and she's been trying to sort through what are the incentives to get college students to be vaccinated. Because if you keep telling them they have to do the same thing before and after vaccination, it's not much of an incentive.
No, you really do need to make it something that people really want to get, especially as I think as the numbers come down, we may see
Yeah,
hesitancy go up
right.
because there isn't that burning sense of I need to protect myself. And we'll particularly see that in younger age groups, I fear.
It's been so striking when my friends, as they're accumulating vaccination, we've talked about whether we'll get together. And some friends go, yeah, when we're all vaccinated, we'll get together. But other friends have said to me, when we're all vaccinated, there's still a risk. So we're not going to be getting together. Human nature, how this will play out over the next year is remarkable. And I'm struck as people want to return to work, are people going to say, well, is the person standing next to me, has that person been vaccinated or not? I'm just not sure how all of this will play out over the next year. Do you have any instincts about that? I mean, you have a large group of people who work at IHME. I'm sure you're not going to mandate vaccination. Do you have a sense of how it will work out when you're open for people to return to the office?
I think we're going to find that people split into two groups, and there'll be those that say they don't see any need for taking risk because, remote work works for them. So why take any risk? And then there'll be some that will be willing to balance that risk out. I think the really interesting thing, Howard, is as we look to next winter, and if there is a third wave, because we don't get the vaccination levels, up into the 90s that would be needed, and, the new variant, the vaccines are,
Right.
unless we get boosters, we won't just have enough transmission blocking. What will some people do? Will some people say, look, I'm just going to accept the risk
Right.
like seasonal flu? Or will
Right.
we see, a group of people, particularly older people or people with comorbidity saying, no, in the winter, I'm going to wear a mask and I'm going to avoid social interaction and not go back to normal in the winter months. And then, we end up with a very different world than we have had in the past.
Last question, Chris. Your career has been in global health. Have you been encouraged or disappointed about the importance and the push to vaccinate the world?
I think the fact that the scientific community has been able to produce these super effective vaccines in record time is just so wonderful and encouraging. And also that everyone is quite focused with, issues around vaccine nationalism for sure, but
Right.
on trying to get these vaccines rolled out to the world in record time. So those are very encouraging signs. I'm also encouraged by how much science has been at the center of all the debates about, how we deal with COVID in a way that hasn't been true for most global health challenges. So those are things that really are positive parts of what's been happening.
This is Howard Bachner, editor-in-chief of JAMA, and I've been talking with Chris Murray. Chris is the director of the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. I think people who have followed global health for the last 2 decades know the important contribution that Chris and his group has made to global health. He, along with Peter Piot, have written a viewpoint for JAMA entitled The Potential Future of the COVID-19 Pandemic. Will it become a recurrent seasonal disease? Chris, thanks so much for joining me today.
Great to have had a chance to talk to you, Howard.
And for our listeners, for more of our podcasts, please visit us at jamanetworkaudio.com. You can listen and subscribe on your favorite podcast app.